Okay, this is Nitro 7.3 about traversing array lists. And in this assignment, we've got an array which we would like to turn into all odd integers by removing the even integers. So first of all, they've created an array list of integer objects called odds, and we are doing a loop and adding numbers to the list. And the way they're adding numbers to the list, odds is going to end up looking like this. So the first time through the loop, index is 1, and we're adding a 1 and adding a 1. Next time through the list, index is 2, and we're adding a 2 and adding a 2, and so on. So the array is going to end up looking like this. And then when we're done adding all those items to the array, we want to say remove evens and pass along this array called odds. So we have to implement this method down here that's actually going to remove the odds. Remove the evens. So we're going to go all the way through the array. Kind of the standard way of going through the array, from int I equals 0 to I less than the array dot size I plus plus. And the standard way of checking if something is even is to see if mod 2 of that number is 0. So if the array get the item at index I, if that number mod 2 is equal to 0, then the number's even, so we would like to remove it. So array dot remove the item at I. And this will partially work when we're done removing all of the evens allegedly. Then we'll go through another loop, int I equals 0, I less than array dot size I plus plus system dot out dot print line array, get the item at index I. This will print out the array. And you will see I still have some evens in the list. There were 2 2s, now there's only 1. There were 2 4s, now there's only 1. So what it has done is it's looked at index 0. That was not even, so it did nothing. Then it looked at index 1. That was not even, so it did nothing. It looked at index 2, and that was even, so it removed it. And now it's done looking at index 2, so now it looks at index 3. 0, 1, 2, 3. And notice this 2 never got looked at because we found a 2 at index 2 and then we removed it. So then this other 2 became at index 2. So when we remove this item here, we have to make sure that index 2 gets checked again. But of course, not just index 2, anytime we remove. So the trick around that is to say, after removing that item, say I minus minus. So we just removed the item at index 2. We say I minus minus, so now I is back to 1. And then when we're done with this iteration of the loop, we come back up here and we add 1 to I. So now I is right back at 2. And we're checking index 2 again, which now contains an even number because that other even number slid over. So this is the little trick. You just have to be really careful when you're traversing arrays and changing the size of the array while you're traversing it. So let's run this and make sure this works okay. And now we see the 2s are gone, the 4s are gone, the 6s are gone. So this works the way it's supposed to work, and we're good there. Okay, then Nitro 4.3.7, ArrayList helper methods. They are creating an array list of string objects called string array, and they are adding 6 strings to that array. And they're going to print out that array. But we have to implement this print method. Let me temporarily comment out all this other stuff. And we're going to implement the print method. So in ArrayList methods, we're going to have a static method called print. So ArrayList methods, we want a public static void called print. And what we need to be supplied to us is an array list of string objects, and we can call it anything. I'm going to just call it A. An array list of string objects called A. I could call it ARR, I could call it array, I could call it list. I'm just calling it A. Okay, so for int I equals 0, I less than the array dot size I plus plus, let's print out each of those items. System.out.print line, the array, which is A, dot get the item at index I. Print that out. I think that's all we want to have happen. So let's see if this works. If it does, then we've successfully implemented the print method. Okay, so next up, we have to implement something called condense. So let's take a look over here at what condense looks like. They want us to take this array and take these first 2 items, combine them together into one string, and have that at location 0. And then take these 2 items at index 2 and 3, combine them into one string, and put that at index 1, and so on. So this is a method called condense. So let's come over here. Public static void condense, and once again we need an array list of string objects. We could call that anything we want. I'm going to call it list this time just to be a little bit different. For int I equals 0, I less than the list dot size and I plus plus. So now we want to do this condensing. So we want to take our list, getting the item at index I, and our list, getting the item at index I plus 1. We want to combine those 2 things together as a new string. Okay, or maybe we can say something like this, string combined. So we're going to make this string called combined that puts together the item at index 0 and the item at index 1. And now I want to add that item at index 0. So I want to, for our array that's called list, I want to add at index I the combined that I just made. So what we are doing here is we are taking the item at index 0 and the item at index 1. We are combining them together into one string like that. And then we are adding that to our string right in position 0. But then we immediately want to remove the item at index 1 because we don't want those individual strings to be there anymore. So list.remove the item at index I plus 1. And watch, when I do that, everything else shifts over. So now the string is at location I plus 1. So I went to remove item I plus 1 again. So now we have these two strings combined into one at index 0 and everything else slid over. So I think that right there is exactly what we want to do. And then my string is going to go to index 1, which is here, and do it again. So I'm pretty sure that's what we want to do. So let's take a look at how this is running. So this is index 0, and ArrayList is index 1, of strings is index 2. That's working correctly. I should mention that you don't even have to do this line here. It makes it a little bit slicker, but also a little bit harder to read. You could copy all of this and throw it right into here instead of creating that string called combined, and it'll work just the same. It'll work just as beautifully. Okay, so now the next thing we have to do is implement something called duplicate. So we are duplicating. So now we want to take each element of the array and duplicate it in the next position, they say, specifically in the next position. So public static void duplicate. And again, we need an array list of string objects called the list. Again, I'm just making up names there. For int I equals 0, I less than the list dot size I plus plus. Stay tuned. I think we're going to need to change that plus plus, but that's the standard way we start. Okay, so I'm going to take the list and I'm going to add something at index I plus 1. And what am I going to add at index I plus 1? I'm going to add the item that's currently at index 0. So the list dot get the item at index I. So the first time through the loop, we're going to take the item that's at index 0 and we're going to add it at index 1. So then we'll have this, and this 2, 3 slides over 1. So that's in index 2 now. But here's why we need to change the I++, because now we don't want to go from index I equals 0 to I equals 1, because if we go to I equals 1, then we'll be sitting on the item that we just inserted. And if we do our code, we're going to insert that again, and we're going to insert it again. We don't want to keep inserting that. So instead of I++, I think we want to do I plus equals 2. So we're going to be at index 0, and then we're going to add this exact same item at index 1. Then the next time through the loop, we're going to be at index 2, and we're going to add that exact same item at index I plus 1, which will be 3. So I think that's what we want to do there. And you see now we have this is twice, and we have an array list twice, and we have of strings twice. So I'm pretty sure that's what we were supposed to do there. Okay, so now this index out of bounds is a very common error when you're messing with lists, and again when you're adding or removing items as you're going through a list. So the reason why this popped up is the string, the array that they gave us to test our code on just happens to have an even number of items in it. And what we did not consider is this. If we just take this, what if this array only had 5 items in it? If this array only had 5 items in it, on the next iteration, we would combine these 2 strings into one string, and then we would add that in location 1, or I should say index 1, right here, and then we would remove index 2 and remove index 2 again, and then our code is trying to do this. It's trying to combine this string with the string after it, but there is no string after it. So that's why we're getting the index out of bounds. So we want to stop right here if we have an odd number of numbers in that array. And kind of a trick or a sneaky way to do this is to do this with our loop. Instead of going up to the list size, let's go up to the list size divided by 2, and then whatever that answer is, multiply by 2. So here's what this accomplishes. If the size of the list is 6, you divide by 2, and that's 3, and then you turn around and multiply that by 2, and that's 6. So we're still going to go up to I less than 6 if the list size is 6. But if the list size is 5, but this would apply to any odd number, but if the list size is 5, then we do the list size divided by 2, which is technically 2.5, but since we're doing integer math, that 2.5 gets truncated to 2, and then we multiply by 2, which is 4. So instead of going from I up to I less than 5, we're going to go up to I less than 4 when that's an odd number. So now I think that little trick right there will solve that index out of bounds problem there. And we're done with 7.3.7. All right, then 7.3.8 is road trip. And we're looking at that geolocation class again that we looked at in a couple other lessons. So one of the key features of geolocation is this method that calculates the distance from one geolocation to another geolocation. So there's a lot of stuff to do here. Let's click through this assignment. We have 3 classes. In the geolocation class, add a private instance variable called name. So now a geolocation is going to have a string instance variable called name, which means our constructor is going to need a string, which we'll call the name, and then our constructor has to take the parameter the name and store it into our instance variable name. Okay, that represents the name of the location. And then we modified the geolocation constructor, and so then along with our getter methods for get latitude and get longitude, we're also going to need a getter method, public string get name, that just returns the name. So we have a getter method for We got a getter method for the name. We already modified the constructor, so we're good there. Getter method name. Update the toString. So the toString said latitude blah, longitude blah, and we want to change that. We want this toString to say the name of the geolocation, and then a space, and then parentheses, and then whatever the latitude is, and then a comma, and then a space, and then whatever the longitude is, and then an end parenthesis. So we want the toString to look like that. Okay, so I think we're done with geolocation. Now we need to create a road trip class. So road trip needs to have an array list of geolocations. So not an array list of integers or strings, but an array list of geolocations. So array list of geolocation, let's call it trip, and that's going to equal, now let's just leave it at that. So you'll have to have an array list as an instance variable, and then the road trip constructor should initialize the array list. So we need a public road trip. Our constructor should initialize the array list called trip to equal a new array list of geolocation. Double parentheses like that. So just initializing that variable. And I think that's all we're going to do. We're not going to have a name for this road trip or anything like that. And then we have to implement these methods. So create a geolocation and add it to the trip. So we're going to say geolocation, this stop equals new geolocation, and we're going to pass along name and latitude and longitude that they gave us. So we are taking the name, latitude, and longitude that they passed us as parameters, and we're turning right around and passing those to the geolocation class as parameters. That creates a new geolocation, which we are temporarily going to call this stop. And then, since we have an array list of geolocations called trip, we're going to add this stop to our array list of geolocations called trip. So create a geolocation and add it to the road trip. By the way, like we've said before, you could copy this piece of code here, which creates the new geolocation, and you could plug that right into there and do this all on one step if you wanted to. So all of this here could go right here, and you've accomplished the same thing all in one step. Okay, so that's implemented. Get the total number of stops. That's an easy one. All we have to do is return the trip.size, which will be an integer. So that's easy. This one, return the total number of miles of the trip. That's going to be a little bit tougher to implement. So we're going to start off with a double called the miles, and we're going to initialize that to be 0. And then we're going to set up a loop that goes through our trip array. I equals 0, the standard way of doing this, I less than the trip array dot size, and I plus plus. And actually we're going to go up to not less than the trip size, but less than the trip size minus 1. And I'll explain why in a second. I'm going to create a double called this leg. And this leg is going to be in our trip array. Let us get the geolocation at index I. So the first time through the loop, that's getting at index 0. And then since it's a geolocation, we have a method called distance from. And distance from requires another geolocation. So the other geolocation is going to be our trip array dot get the geolocation at index I plus 1. So basically, this for first time through this loop, we are getting the item at index I, the item at index 0 from our array, and we're finding the distance from that to the item at index I plus 1 in the array. So the first time through, it's the distance from the geolocation at index 0 to the geolocation in index 1. And then the next time through the loop, it's getting the distance from the geolocation at index 1 to the geolocation at index 2, and so on. And since this is looking at index I plus 1, that's why we don't want to go up to less than trip size. We want to go up to trip size minus 1. If we didn't have that minus 1, we would get an index out of bounds exception. And then once we have that distance, we're going to say the miles plus equals this leg. And once again, I could have done that all in one step. I could have just put all of this stuff here, right there, and done it all on one line. So after going through that loop, we are going to return the miles. So I think that's what we want this to look. Oh, we got to implement the toString. So we have to have a toString method that's going to print out this. So public string toString. So I'm going to create a string variable called this trip. I'm going to start it off initialized to be the empty string for int I equals 0. Again, I'm going to iterate through the array I less than trip dot size I plus plus. And every time through, what I'm going to add to the string is called this trip plus equals. We first have to add this little number out in front here. So we're going to say I plus 1, because we want the first to be a numeral 1, even though our index is starting at 0. And then we're going to add a period and a space. And then we're going to add our trip array dot get the item at index I. And this will use the toString method of geoclass, which remember we already changed the toString method geoclass to show us the name of the trip, like the name of the geolocation, like San Francisco and latitude and longitude. So we already implemented that toString. So that's going to do that. And then I think we're also going to want to do one more thing at the end of this. Since we're returning a string and we're not doing a bunch of print line statements, I think we're going to need a \n at the end of that. And then after going through that loop and creating that line for each item in the array, then we can just say return this trip. Okay, so they're going to add these 3 stops. They already have that in the code. And then when they say print line road trip, that should accomplish this. And then they're going to print stops, and they're going to use our get number of stops method we just wrote. And then for the miles, they're going to use our get trip length method that we just wrote. So let's see if this runs okay, or if I'm missing a semicolon somewhere or whatever. This miles in road trip. Oh, I said the miles, not this miles. The miles. Let's try running that again. Okay, so that looks all right. Frisco, Los Angeles, Las Vegas. 3 stops, 572 miles. That looks like it's doing what we need it to do. Okay, so we are done with Nitro 7.3.